Hello and welcome to a very special Dr. Brian McDonough show. My guest is Dr. Michelle Comer. Dr. Michelle Comer is joining me from Galway, Ireland. She is a professor at the National University of Ireland in Galway. I know her quite well because she was my instructor in Irish studies at NUI Galway, and it was a wonderful experience, which, by the way, I'd recommend to anyone as far as education and learning about the history of Ireland. But I wanted to have you on today because your specialty, I just have always found fascinating, which is really looking at medieval Ireland. You've studied this through your whole life. You've been an archaeologist for 20 years on digs. You've done all sorts of things, easy to follow on the internet and see what's going on. But of course, in the United States, this is also St. Patrick's Week. We're talking about St. Patrick's Day, and I want to bring him up at a certain point as well. But first of all, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm admiring your green lights there behind you.
I'm getting into the flow here in the studio. One thing you can't do on the internet is create things the way you want. But my first question for you, we'll start with that. Okay, so I have the green lights. I've got the green tie. I'm looking very Irish. St. Patrick's Day is a big thing here in the United States. Tell me a little bit about Ireland itself. How big is St. Patrick's Day there? Was it big? Does it continue to stay big? Has it evolved? Where are we with that?
Yeah, well, I suppose it is, and has been the national holiday for quite some time. And yeah, I suppose it is obviously celebrated all over the island as well as all over the world. I suspect the mode of celebration probably changes a little from place to place. For most Irish people, how you celebrate probably depends on whether you have children or not. If you have children, they're invariably involved in local parades and other festivities and events. For adults, then obviously there are different types of celebrations that more often than not will end up with a little tipple or two. So it varies greatly.
It's interesting. Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting that I was looking, of course, this whole program has evolved out of initially doing lots of reports on COVID and going through the COVID crisis, started to use the internet and realized I want to have some fun with this as well. I mean, certainly there's important information from a health standpoint that I feel I can present, but just to enjoy life and to enjoy learning and to share things with people, it's a great tool as well, which is how this program evolved. And one of the things I have to bring COVID into is that they were saying how in the United States, especially in the United States, it's St. Patrick's Day 2 years ago was right about the time when there was a realization that it was a pandemic. The World Health Organization had come out and said this. And I was doing some research to talk with you, just reading about St. Patrick's Day in Ireland this year. And for instance, in Dublin, there's a 5-day celebration, which probably at the time we're recording is going on. But they were saying it's one of the biggest years ever because there was the lockdown, there was COVID, there were so many other things. And, when you look at celebrations like that, it's interesting to see how, we recover and we try to keep our spirits up and try to find things to enjoy. That being said, in your work, it's really interesting how I'm going back and looking at medieval Ireland, going to ask you some specific questions, but St. Patrick came up because in those reports, people were saying they were studying religion at the time of St. Patrick when he came to Ireland in the 5th century and looking at the origins of Christianity. And that might be a good place to start, how you can use archaeology to find out the distant history of a people. Tell me a little bit about how you use it to see the lives of people at the time and try to learn from that.
Well, I suppose the main point about archaeology is it's the study of the physical remains of the past. So it's the things that people built, the things that they made, the things that they lost, the things they left behind. It's the hard evidence. So we can use that evidence in historic eras to test kind of documentary evidence from those eras, which aren't always, as you might expect, reliable. And of course, we can push it back into pre-literate eras as well, times when we don't have written evidence. And the time of St. Patrick, as you said, in and around the 5th century AD, is a time when literacy is beginning to be introduced into Ireland. And many of our early documents from that era, we call it, starting in the 5th century, the early medieval period, many of the documents that survive from that era are not 100% reliable. And when it comes to church-related documents, especially when people are writing about saints and early saints, there is often a lot of deliberate kind of exaggeration in the texts where they're describing the miracles performed by these saints. And, a lot of stories and legend then build up around a lot of these early figures like St. Patrick. For example, if St. Patrick had actually founded all of the churches around Ireland that he's supposed to have founded, then he would have lived for several centuries because it would have taken him that long to actually get to them all. So you can see how these stories and legends and reputations build up over time. Much of it deliberately so. It was in the best interests of the early monasteries and churches to promote their own saint. And therefore, the saint's reputation rubbed off on the actual monastery as well. So, in and around the 5th century, it's a transitional era. We have some documentary evidence that I suppose suggests some things about that time, but we have a lot of kind of hard physical evidence, archaeological evidence that we can use to test those documents and fill out the picture a little bit more. And I suppose it works both ways. There are gaps in the archaeological record as well, where if you're lucky, you can apply some of the written evidence. So around about the time of St. Patrick, it was a very interesting few centuries in Ireland where society was changing politically, economically, as well as the introduction of this new religion. Now, of course, St. Patrick himself wasn't the first Christian in Ireland. We know the year before Patrick, around about the year 430, 431, the Pope in Rome had sent another bishop called Paladius to Ireland to minister to the Christians who were already here. So sometime before, maybe in the early 400s, there were Christians living in Ireland. Paladius was the first official, their first official bishop, and then Patrick is recorded the following year. But of course, Paladius has been forgotten, and we all know, what has happened to Patrick in the intervening centuries, and all that has built up around that particular figure and everything that he has come to symbolize.
If I remember my studies well, Patrick actually was basically taken from his home. He was brought to another country where he was educated, and then he came back to Ireland, and that's when he began, I would say, prophesizing and touring the country, more or less trying to spread the word. That's my understanding. That's at least do we have historical record of that from documentation?
We have his own writings, and we have other writings that record him actually being taken as a slave, essentially, on a raid. So he was living in kind of Romano-British kind of Wales, southern Britain, and he was taken during a raid by an Irish group as a slave, brought back to Ireland where he was put to work, and he eventually leaves Ireland again, goes away, as you say, is educational, and then returns of his own volition later on as a missionary, essentially.
There's so much more to talk with you, but to just kind of conclude a little bit with St. Patrick and what you were saying, it's St. Brigid's Day, which is February 1st, is a very important time. And it was interesting to see again how this well of Brigid, which had been more or less a pagan type of ritualistic center, the church kind of took and made its own. And that seemed to have happened along, like you were talking about, taking things and kind of bringing it into a monolithic God and bringing Christianity. That happened a lot, I guess, as Ireland, as you say, changed in that early medieval period.
Yeah, I suppose Christianization was a very slow and gradual thing here in Ireland in the early medieval period. Part of that, and probably just part of it, was the acquisition of earlier ritual or religious or spiritual sites that were already important to the people. and changing them so that they were no longer pagan, but they were Christian monuments. So we see that in a number of places. I think today sometimes people can almost interpret that in a different way than it actually happened. I think at the time it was a very deliberate thing to not destroy paganism, but neither were they trying to continue it. They were trying to change it into and transform it into the new religion. So it wasn't a deliberate attempt to continue certain pagan traditions. It was a deliberate attempt to change them. So I know that today people looking back sometimes like to think that the early Irish church was trying deliberately to preserve some pagan traditions, but I don't think that was quite the case. I think it was trying to change those traditions and make it easier for people to transition from earlier beliefs to the Christian ones. So it's a very interesting kind of process. And clearly it was a process that was extremely successful over the course of at least a couple of centuries.
Dr. Michelle Comer is my guest. She is a professor at the National University of Ireland in Galway, and we're talking initially about St. Patrick, but I do want to move to an area where you study. You actually have spent a long period of time and actually documented on Facebook. It's fascinating to see, studying a ring fort. Now, ring forts, I guess, are enclosed farmsteads, and there's thousands of them in Ireland right now, but the one you're looking at is particularly interesting. It's called Caherconnel Stone Fort, and you've been in a place in Ireland, if anyone's traveled there, and I'm sure many have, called the Burren, where it's actually very rocky. And to build the fort, unlike a lot of forts that might have had dirt surrounding them and other things, it's actually stone, encircled by stone. So you can see it today, and I have an image of that when you come to the YouTube site and to see this of what it looks like. But you're there and you're doing digs. I mean, you have found some fascinating things, like the first, I guess you could call it an ink pen from way back. Tell me a little bit about that work and what you're learning from studying this fort.
Well, I suppose the first thing to note is maybe little something about these ring forts. So the people that Patrick and those who came after him were preaching to and ministering to, the population of early medieval Ireland, the vast majority of them lived in a monument that we now call a ring fort. So these were the most common settlement form in the era. There are at least 45,000 of them recorded across Ireland, and the estimates of the original number go anywhere up to 120,000. There were no native towns or villages, so every family pretty much lived in one of these ring forts. They were essentially enclosed farmsteads. So you had your farmhouse with some sort of rampart around it. Now, across most of Ireland, those ramparts were built of earth. So a great big earthen bank with a dug ditch or foss outside it. But along the western seaboard of Ireland, where you have more rock outcrop and less depth of soil, they built their rampart of stone, dry stone, so no mortar being used. And I started studying those ring forts when I was doing my PhD a number of years ago. We won't say how many. And over the years, I have continued studying them and have, I suppose, even specialized now in the stone versions, the cahers or cashels, as they're called. And this particular one that you mentioned, Caherconnel, in the Burren region of North County Clare, is a particularly fascinating site or example of these cashels. So I suppose where the work started, probably was my initial interest in ring forts, in doing my PhD. After that then, well, I'm a native Galwegian, so I'm just, not even an hour's drive from this Burren region. So I've always been aware of all the stone ring forts down there. And there is excellent preservation of archaeology in this region, including the ring forts and indeed the farms that went with them, the actual fields, which is unusual. They're usually, long gone in other parts of the island. So I started a research project down there many moons ago, mapping these field systems and these ring forts. And I got to know various other archaeologists and indeed landowners, farmers in the area. And eventually, I think it was in 2007, myself and another professional archaeologist in Clare, Graham Hull, we got talking with one of the landowners, John Davern, in the Burren. And he had this large cashel on his land, Caherconnel. He had built a small visitor centre, but he had no specific information about his particular cashel. So we decided in 2007 that we would put together a little volunteer excavation, just a week. We excavated a small trench. It was only a metre wide, about 5.5 metres in length. And what we found in that particular trench, well, it made us realise we wanted to excavate some more at the site. But we had no funding for such an undertaking. That was all voluntary. So it took a couple of years, but in conjunction with the farmer, with John Davern, we set up an international field school whereby students come, they pay a fee to learn how to excavate, and that fee then paid for the actual excavation. So over the course of about 10 summers, we systematically excavated the entire interior of this particular settlement. And it turned out to be extraordinary. It was extraordinary, I suppose, for Ringfort studies, first of all, because it changed our dating of them. So for us, Ringforts had always been an early medieval settlement form. So that meant anywhere between the 5th and the 12th centuries AD. We say the 12th century because that's when the Anglo-Normans come and they change the landscape of Ireland again. However, at Caherconnell, we discovered it was built in the late 10th century, which is the late 900s, which is fine, early medieval period. But here's the interesting thing. It continued in use right through to the start of the 17th century, right through all those decades and centuries when the Anglo-Normans arrived into Ireland and began to change things. So for once, here we have, well, new dating for Ringforts, but even more significantly, we have almost for the first time archaeological evidence, hard physical evidence of what the native families were doing during those centuries. And in this case, very specifically, a high status native family. So there's a possibility that in the late 10th century, in the 900s, the people who built the cashel were the local rulers, part of a royal family. Now, royal in early medieval terms is different to what we understand by it today. There were at least 150 kings in early medieval Ireland at any given time. So whoever built this site was of that ilk, of that status. And as time progresses, they become, after various political events, kind of the Gaelic lords. So this is probably the highest status settlement in this particular area from the 10th century right through to maybe the 16th century or thereabouts. So it has been a very rewarding site to work on. It has changed our understanding of chronology of the past. It has put a native family back into the picture of medieval Ireland, which is obviously extremely important. And it's helping us to understand the greater kind of landscape and what was going on in the area. And, we might even be able to draw conclusions from this that are relevant to other parts of Ireland where they don't have the same kind of level of preservation. And I suppose, those are the primary things. Kind of a secondary benefit has been working with the local community on this project. So working hand in hand with the Davern family who own Caherconnell. And I suppose using my, obviously, professional research, academic archaeological research, to work with the local community, but also, due to the field school, with the international community. Most of our students who come every summer are international students, most of them from North America. So it's a really nice example of how a research project can reach out, on lots of different levels. It's very rewarding for us, obviously, in terms of the archaeology. That goes without saying. It has been an extremely rich and very significant site. But there's more to it than just that. So you mentioned, some of the finds from the site, and yes, the ink pen has been one of the most interesting, and it almost kind of brings us back to the whole Christianity thing again, because literacy in early Ireland is associated with Christianity. So the early monks, they're the ones who are the literate element of society. They're the ones who can read and write for the first time in Ireland. And up until now, early medieval literacy has been solely associated with the church, with these monastic scribes. But now, for the first time, we have this pen, this writing implement from an 11th century layer in a secular settlement. So we have evidence that a literate person was active in a secular context in the 11th century. So this is something completely new for us as well. So it's adding to our picture and understanding of high status families, from the late 10th century onwards.
It's hard to understand in the United States, and to an extent, the long history in Europe or in Ireland, a place where you can go back, like it might be 200, 300 years. We see things. All you have to do is go, to many places in Europe, and you'll see, buildings that are older than the United States. But to go back like this, and you see, I know, for instance, in Ireland, a lot of information was gained, as you say, from the religious elite, I guess, with the annals and other places where people could go back and read things and learn about the kings and the families. But to get this, what you're doing is you're finding out about people who lived throughout the island. And I think that's a type of research that, not that the annals are easy to come by, but certainly is not easy to come by. It's a lot of backbreaking work, going in and doing that. And I would think it has to be rewarding, because you can see, especially as you say, it's your neighbors not far away in the Burren who you actually get to know and see what the history of your community essentially is, and not just history, but you're talking about 1,000, if not more, years ago. Want to shift a little to one other area, and that is to talk about the megalithic tombs. Every year, it's always a big event in the United States. People watch it, is to see Newgrange, to see what's going on, to watch that. But people just kind of go, wow, that's a cool place, but they don't really understand what it is and how it developed and why these tombs are there and when they were built. Tell me a little bit about these tombs. And they also, Newgrange is famous, but there's these tombs all over Ireland as well.
Okay. I think probably the story starts even prior to that. The first human activity on the island of Ireland, the first human proper settlement, is in what we call the Mesolithic, which is the Middle Stone Age, maybe about 10,000 years ago or thereabouts. We get our first proper settlements. And those people lived by hunting and gathering, and they were probably nomadic, moving around the place. But then, maybe around 4,000 BC or thereabouts, agriculture is introduced, and that changes everything. So now people begin to farm the land. And when they do that, they settle. They stay at the land that they're farming for obvious reasons. And I suppose part of that kind of more stable settlement and the acquisition of land, the claiming, the ownership of land, they required some way of demonstrating that, of demonstrating their connection with this land that they're now using in a different way. And one of the ways in which they did that in the Neolithic or the New Stone Age was through the building of large burial monuments or large religious monuments. Today we call them tombs because, yes, people were buried inside them, but they probably had, many more functions, almost like great cathedrals of the time. And you mentioned Newgrange and the monuments of the Boyne Valley. Those are what we call passage tombs, and they are but one of three different types of megalithic tombs that existed in Neolithic Ireland. They're the biggest of them, and they have attracted most attention. And of those, obviously, Newgrange is the one that has attracted most attention. But there are many passage tombs in different parts of Ireland, other groupings or cemeteries of them. There are tombs that we call court tombs and tombs that we call portal tombs. These are the three kind of main categories of these Neolithic or Stone Age monuments. And they all represent kind of the ritual beliefs or spiritual beliefs of the people at the time. Now, of course, this is prehistory. So we are reliant on the physical evidence to tell us what we know about them. And of course, when you have physical evidence, some of it is very obvious as to what it represents, and some of the evidence then is more open to interpretation, or at least the reasons why things were built and made the way they were. And I think that's probably why Newgrange has attracted, so much attention, because it has this kind of astrological alignment that is very obvious once a year, and puts on, well, weather permitting, puts on a certain light show in December every year. But, and yes, I mean, rightly so, it should attract attention. But sometimes I think it maybe attracts too much attention, in that the rest of the other equally interesting monuments don't get any attention whatsoever. So sites like Newgrange and Tara in Ireland, or Stonehenge in Britain, or the Egyptian pyramids, they serve a purpose almost, in that they get people interested in the past. And then hopefully it encourages them to look further, to find the other monuments and the people behind those most celebrated examples. Because the stories, the eras, they are almost, I won't say much richer, but they are equally as rich as, the well-known sites.
If you're enjoying this interview with Dr. Michelle Comer, there will be a link provided to an interview we conducted recently with the Irish ambassador to the United States, Daniel Mulhall. Daniel Mulhall was not only just a gracious guest, but he also talked a great deal about the relationship between Ireland, the United States, and the world, and a little bit of more recent history, but fascinating. So I will provide that link as well. We've talked about a lot of things. Michelle, what did I not ask you that you think you'd want to bring up with our audience that you'd like to talk about before we do wrap it up?
I suppose maybe, something about my own work here. I, for the past, well, over 20 years now, have been teaching online. And this is something that has exploded, obviously, in the last couple of years for obvious reasons. But it's something that I have always found very rewarding. And it's obviously something you have experienced firsthand. And I think it allows us, as we have seen, to reach out more. So I might be excavating a site here, and it produces this amazing story. But it's the online teaching and reaching out that allows us to share those stories, which I think is a vital part of what we do. If we don't do that, then what's the point? Yes, we create knowledge, but we keep it in our office. And to me, that seems pointless. So being able to share these stories in a reliable fashion. Now, you will find websites on all sorts of things, obviously. Many of those are not reliable. The information contained within them is not, should we say, academic. It hasn't been tested. So for us to be able to reach out and teach in an academic fashion at various different levels, it doesn't have to be an onerous thing. That for me, I think, is extremely rewarding. To be able to have someone for a year or two, even just part-time, to reveal the facts of the past. We all have our assumptions and presumptions and our desires to interpret the past in a certain way, to create an identity for ourselves. But I've always found that people are actually fascinated by the reality behind those stories and presumptions, and are more than willing to learn about them, and to even change how they think about themselves and about the past. And I think that is really the primary aim of education, be it archaeological or any other form. So, yeah, for me, reaching out online has been a wonderful experience. Not just, sharing my own work, but, in the broader context, be it in my own teaching of Irish Studies diploma online. I also teach an Irish archaeology diploma online. And then that obviously coupled with the physical interaction in my summer field school, with students coming into me as opposed to me going out to them online. It really has made the world a smaller place, but a much more interesting place as well.
And I will vouch for that. Years ago, I got my dual citizenship, Ireland and the United States, wanted to learn more, had no idea how exciting it would be. And I think in my family, for instance, it showed my children in their 20s the importance of lifelong learning. They got the biggest kick. In fact, they got a chance to meet you at graduation, but they got the biggest kick out of it because I think at one point you were polite, but you chastised me and said, Brian, Wikipedia is not a resource that you can use. And my kids were like, you quoted something from Wikipedia? Are you crazy? And I was like, hey, I know what Wikipedia is. Give me a break. But it was funny because they love the fact that, their dad, or if I didn't get the highest grade on something, they got the biggest kick out of it. And it was a great way to show them that, when you're learning, you're learning. You're there, you're working with an expert now who's teaching you. But to your point, and I do want to tell people if they're interested, and I certainly would say the NUI Galway courses are amazing, and your courses in particular, but you were able to establish a community. It was a discussion. You made a point that we would read the works of other people and comment. And it was by and large very pleasant, people making nice comments, but they would pick up critical things. In fact, there was an air traffic controller who by nature is meticulous. We would go back and forth on things, and it became fun because you were being pushed. And I think that's another aspect of it. And I had no idea the history of Ireland and just how extensive it was, because you're going way back, and the stories, and obviously in a course like that, there's a literature component, a history component, archaeology component. There's all these different components that were woven in. It wasn't just one area. Do you see that continuing to grow? I mean, as a university professor, do you see just more and more of this as time goes on?
In certain areas, yes, I would hope so. The world has obviously become a much smaller place in the past couple of years. If there is a silver lining, that's probably it. It has become easier for us to teach people scattered around the world. Now, it's not for everyone, obviously. Many people prefer to learn in person, and that will never change, nor should it. But I think, instead of replacing what we did traditionally, I think adding to it is the way forward, is an excellent thing. And I think many of us will obviously continue to do that. Some won't, which is fine also. I think there's plenty of room for all approaches, really. I suppose I have been used to teaching online, but teaching what we would call non-traditional or mature students, folks who are very self-motivated. And in the past couple of years, we've kind of seen another side to teaching online, teaching traditional undergraduates, people in their late teens, for the most part. And many of them found it very difficult to learn without the face-to-face interaction. So, yeah, well, I suppose that's another learning from the past couple of years. Distance learning or online learning isn't for everyone, but it does suit an awful lot of people if it's done correctly. Now, in the past couple of years, a lot of us have had to kind of implement emergency online teaching without proper preparation time. So that perhaps has given some people a poor experience of online learning. But I think for programs like my own that have been in existence long before COVID was even, heard of, those have the proper preparation time, and they are delivered in, I suppose under best practice, really. So those are the ones, if you're looking for an online program, those are the ones to look out for, those that have been in existence, for more than 2 or 3 years, and have had the proper lead-in time and preparation time, because those will give you a proper experience of online learning.
Dr. Michelle Comer, I want to thank you for joining me today on the Dr. Brian McDonough Show. It's been fascinating. I appreciate your time. I know how busy you are, and it was great to share some stories and to learn even more.
You're very welcome, and happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone.
You too. Thank you.